Okay, so yesterday we learned two explanations of the pasuk the Maamar is based on. Pasuk says, "If a spirit of rulership comes upon you, do not leave your place, because if you do, you will leave. There will be great sins." So we learned the explanation from Targum Innocent. Targum Innocent says that if you feel Yetzer Hara is ruling over you, you feel that Yetzer Hara is getting the best of you. So the advice of Hashem to you is, don't leave your place, don't let go of your Torah study. Because if you do, Chas v'sholom, big mistakes can happen. But if you don't, if you learn Torah, then you will leave great sins. The great sins will be, Hashem will not hold you responsible for your debts to Him, and will, so to speak, forget your great sins. That's the first explanation. Second explanation is the spirit of rulership is referring to leadership. Hashem gives you an opportunity to lead others. So when that happens, Hashem tells you, do not leave your place. Do not leave your humility. And as we learned yesterday, because Zechariah ben Yehoyada rebuked the people and he spoke down to them, it didn't work. And not only did it not work, but he himself was stoned. On the other hand, Yechaziel ben Zechariah, because of his humility, his words were heard. He made himself like the people. He was considered himself one with the people. And that's why they respected and they heard what he said. So the pasuk is saying, if a spirit of leadership enters you, God gives you a spirit of leadership, God gives you this opportunity to lead, don't lose your humility, because if you do, if you don't leave your humility, if you keep your humility, then you won't be responsible for great sins. So the Rebbe asked, what's the meaning of, if Rebbe asks, what's the meaning of this person who is the leader of the Jewish people being guilty of great sins? We're talking about it, Tzaddik, we're talking about someone who is well versed in Torah, and because he is not humble, he's guilty of great sins. How does it suddenly happen? It sounds like it's a sudden thing. I mean, I don't think the Rebbe is saying, we'll see later, I don't think the Rebbe is saying that how could it be that lack of humility can cause a person to make mistakes? That the Gemara says in Seita clearly that Gemara says that when a person loses humility, they can go all the way down. But it sounds like the very fact that you are not humble, that already makes you culpable of sin. So the question is, what does that mean? So we learned that the word marpe means weakness. And the pasuk is telling you that if you will be humble, you won't be, if you have humility, if you have a weak relationship to the people in the sense that you're not dominating them, then you won't be considered, if you're humble in your relationship with the people, and you don't consider yourself greater to them, then you won't be guilty of their sins. So it's not talking about you making mistakes, rather it's talking about the sins of the people. And it's saying, if you are humble, then you won't be considered guilty for their sins. That's what the word marpe means. Marpe means weaker. If you'll be weak, if you'll be humble, then you won't be considered culpable for their sins. Why? What does that mean? Let's go, let's continue on. Please don't remind me to find the PDF for you, and I will post it with Hashem. Those who are not listening via what's it called? Via the podcast has my number on it. But if you go to Beis Betzal, you can find my number over there. Either way, you can text me and I will add it to the chat, and you will get the PDF. Let's go. Get question.
So I might be getting ahead of myself, but isn't there a, like, don't we learn that Tzaddikim of the generation, Dafka, like, they're responsible for everything?
Right.
And we said, like, there, he says, why does the Arizal say Tafka?
He's talking about on behalf of the sin of the generation. So he is guilty of the sin of the generation.
Yeah.
So we're saying that there are certain sins that they're not guilty of because of their humility, as we'll see.
Okay.
You're right. In general, such a thing. Let's go. Let's start from the line that starts with the words al derech. That starts with the word Torah. You see?
No.
Line starts the word Torah. End the line.
Yeah.
The Moshe Rabbeinu was not punished for the sin of the golden calf. Question is, he is considered the great one of that generation, and the rule is that the great person of the generation, as you just said, is considered responsible for the sins of the generation. So how come Moshe Rabbeinu is not considered guilty of the sin of the golden calf? Elish and Enash, rather you must say that he was punished. As Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, go down from the mountain, and the Talmud explains, don't just go down from the mountain, go down from your greatness. The only reason I gave you greatness, Hashem says, was for the sake of the Jewish people. What was the greatness that Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu? These are the 1,000 lights that God gave to Moshe as a present, and those lights were taken away from him. There was a chassid beside the Liber of Shalom. He used to say that when you open the Aron, we say to Hashem, give us your good light. He used to say, as if we know the difference between the good light and the lesser good light. Like, but we don't know what it means when it says 1,000 lights Moshe Rabbeinu received. But obviously, the number 1,000 indicates that this was a tremendous revelation of godliness. So Moshe Rabbeinu, before the sin of the golden calf, he had these 1,000 lights. Hashem gave them as a present, but Hashem took them away from him after the sin of the golden calf. But only on Shabbos does Moshe Rabbeinu again receive those 1,000 lights. Maamar, and this is what we mean when we say in Shabbos davening, Yismach Moshe manas chalkei. Moshe should rejoice in the gift of his portion. What's his gift? His gift is 1,000 lights that Hashem gives him back on Shabbos. So it's true that Moshe Rabbeinu lost something through the sin of the golden calf, but that's not called a punishment. But he wasn't punished for the sin of the golden calf. And the question is, why not? If the rule is that the great one of the generation is considered responsible for the sins of the generation, how come he wasn't punished? So the fact that he lost these lights is not considered a punishment. It's something that he lost. Hashem gave him the greatness for the sake of the Jewish people, and they weren't. It's like we learned last week about Yaakov Avinu, that Yaakov Avinu, when he wanted to give his children the message of the revelation of the coming Mashiach, and when they weren't ready, so that affected him too. When their spiritual status affected him. But it wasn't that a punishment per se. Yaakov wants to give them something, and they are unable to receive it, so that hurts Yaakov. Moshe Rabbeinu is connected to the Jewish people. When they descend, he descends as well, but it's not a punishment. How come he wasn't punished? Well, that's the rule. The great tzaddik of the generation is responsible. You might want to answer, he wasn't even in the world when the sin of the golden calf happened. He was in heaven. As the Torah says, Moshe Rabbeinu delayed in coming, and the word boishesh, which also means the 6th hour. They expected Moshe Rabbeinu to come in the 6th hour. He didn't come in the 6th hour, and that's why they did the sin of the golden calf. And since he was in heaven during the sin, boishesh means the 6th hour, was the 6th day of Sivan. No, 6th day of, no, 6th hour. Since it was the 17th day of Tammuz. He went up on 6 of 7. Yeah, so the 6th hour of the time he left, they expect him to come. They miscalculated because they thought they should count the day he left as day one. And since he was in heaven during the sin, there, so therefore he can't consider him responsible. He wasn't, so to speak, even alive at the time. He was in heaven. Im Cain, if that's your answer, Aaron and Yeshua, they were alive. They were here. How come they weren't considered responsible for the sin of the generation? Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, you answered. Moshe Rabbeinu, we could say he wasn't considered responsible because he wasn't around. But Aaron and Yeshua were. So the answer is, really, it wasn't just that Moshe wasn't here. There's another factor, and that is that Moshe Rabbeinu was absolutely humble. Moshe Rabbeinu was considered the most humble person alive. And also Aaron was humble. Al Neisel of Meisher and Tachas Aflog, but Misanav, you turn me to Loki, Ish Meisher, Anamay, call him Adam, Shemach Adam. Aaron was humble too, but Moshe Rabbeinu had an extraordinary level of humility to the extent that Torah says that Moshe was the most humble person upon the face of the earth. The Rebbe once said that the Torah emphasizes he was the most humble person from every man. You could have just said he was the most humble, very humble. Why does it emphasize he was humble from more than every man? So Rebbe explained, if you look at the words carefully, he was humble from every man. Some people think that humility means to be humble before God. I'm humble in the face of God. Being humble in front of the face of God is not so easy, not so difficult, because God's greater than you. Real humility means when you see the virtue in other people. That's the emes of humble. He was humble in the face of every person. He saw their virtue. That's the type of he was humble. He was humble from every person. He saw every person had a virtue and how was greater than him in some way. So Moshe in an extraordinary attribute. He was humble, more humble than anyone else. Aaron was not as humble as him. Next page, however, Aaron too was also humble. He wasn't as humble as Moshe Rabbeinu, but he was very humble. But Aaron did possess some level of bittul, which because of Aaron Mahu, as Moshe Rabbeinu said, when the people were complaining about Aaron, Moshe said, "Why are you complaining about Aaron? What is Aaron?" So Chassidus explains that Moshe wasn't just saying, "What is Aaron?" Rather, he was saying that Aaron did Mahu bittul. He was saying that Aaron, his spiritual level is a level of what? What is the word chachma, wisdom, is made up of two parts. Koyach, the power of what? And Aaron embodied the power of chachma. Why does the word what indicate the level of chachma? Because when you first discover the answer for something, things are in a nebulous state. You can't really, it's not really defined yet. All you could say is there's something, you don't know exactly what it is. So if we're talking about the emergence of creation and the very first level of godliness in the world of Atzilus, which is the level of Chachma, things are so nebulous there that all there is, in the words of the Maggid, told Alter Rebbe, all there is in the level of Chachma is a revelation, how there's nothing besides Hashem. So Aaron, he is a embodiment of the sphere of Chachma. He is embodiment of Ma, and Aaron had the same level of bittul like Moshe. As it says in the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu told the people, "What are we? We are what?" So it's interesting. They were different in their level of humility, but they were the same in their level of bittul. There's making a distinction here between humility and bittul. Perhaps, like we said before, humility is about the way you look at other people, the narrative you have for other people. That's another. How you view other people. That's humility. Bittul is a whole different kind of thing. Bittul is about the Eibishter shining into you and you feeling like you're feeling the truth of Hashem in a way that you. Someone asked the following question. It says that Mashiach was asked by the Baal Shem Tov, "When are you coming?" What did Mashiach tell the Baal Shem Tov? He told Baal Shem Tov, "I'm coming when your wall springs will be spread to the outside." Somebody asked, why did the Baal Shem Tov ask this question to Mashiach? It says in Gemara, Mashiach is being delayed until there's rectification for the sin that brought about destruction of the second base of Mikdash. Why was it destroyed? It was destroyed because of senseless hatred. So how is Mashiach giving a different answer than the Gemara? So I don't remember who the answer came from, but the answer I heard was that Mashiach was telling Baal Shem Tov the inner meaning of the words of the Gemara. In order for you to really love people in a way that's real, you have to have real bittul. You really have to put yourself aside. And to put yourself aside, that you get by learning the teachings of Baal Shem Tov. By immersing yourself in the wellsprings of Chassidus and Baal Shem Tov, then you're able, because naturally everyone's a something. Like some people complain, the guy comes into shul and he gets an aliyah. A guest comes to shul and gets an aliyah. And Yankel says, "Rabbi, how can you give Yankel an aliyah?" Now, Yang, the guy who's complaining isn't expecting Aliyah himself. He's not expecting it, but he's bothered. Why did he get an Aliyah? Why is he bothered that the guy got an Aliyah? No, he's bothered because he's a somebody. And the fact there's another somebody that already bothers him because Hashem created us all to be a somebody. So I take up space. The fact that someone else takes up space, that encroaches in my space. That's the pshat senseless hatred. And when Chassidus hopefully gives you this idea of bittul. So bittul is already something godly. It's not just a narrative in your mind how you look at people. Bittul, I mean, before I was saying that being humble before God is easier than being humble before man. That's in the narrative. In the narrative, it's easier. But the second point we're making over here is that not only did Aaron have a level of humility, albeit not as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, he also had a revelation of Hashem in him. He had something of this truth that there's nothing besides Hashem. He had something of that in him. You hear what I'm grappling with over here, Daniel? I want to say that being humble is a greater level than being humble before God. Being humble from people. You get that? Yeah. But then the Rebbe says that Aaron had something else. He had the same bittul as Moshe Rabbeinu. So I think the meaning of bittul is, in the context of humility, okay, so it's greater virtue to be humble before man. But bittul is not the same thing as humility. Bittul means that there is that
no sense of self.
It's not a sense of self, right? So Aaron didn't have a sense of self. Aaron has had the truth of Hashem. That's all that mattered to him. That's all he felt. Think about Chacham Atzilus. Chacham Atzilus is a revelation. All there is Hashem. So Aaron felt that. Aaron felt this truth. All there is Hashem. There is a clip called Ru'uma. You heard of Ru'uma? Ru'uma is the name of one of the wives of Yishmael of Esau. So it says Ru'uma means Ru'uma. Look how batal I am. Look how I'm batal, but look how batal I am. It's possible to have ma, to have bittul, but your narrative in your mind is, yeah, I'm batal. I feel Hashem's truth. Look at that. Look how batal I am. Humility is not the same thing as feeling that you could feel Hashem's truth, and then your narrative could be lousy also. I don't know. It's I'm not really sure what this means, but it seems very clear that the Rebbe is making a distinction between Aaron's bittul and Aaron's humility, and saying he's the same bittul as Moshe, and yet not the same level of humility. This is what the Gemara means when it says, sometimes it puts Aaron before Moshe, says the Gemara. Sometimes the Torah puts Moshe before Aaron. Why? Because they were at the same level. And the Shneim Dirgas Ma, they both were at the level of Ma. They both were at the level of absolute abnegation before Hashem. And therefore, even Aaron, although he was considered the great one of the generation, and although he was alive during the time of the sin of the golden calf, and the golden came into seven demonstration, nevertheless, he is not considered responsible for the sin of the generation. Why? Because of his bittul. Yeshua also had absolute bittul. It says about Yeshua that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to heaven, and then he descended, and the sin of the golden calf happened, and he put his tent at a distance from the people. So it says Yeshua never left the tent. The Pirush Nar made al bittul. It says Yeshua was a lad who never left the tent. The Torah uses the word lad describing Yeshua. Why? Not because he was young, or not because he was foolish, but because he was like a lad in the sense of devotion to Moshe, like a little kid. The whole inyan of Yeshua. The essence of Yeshua was that he was a servant of Moshe. He was absolutely nullified to Moshe to the extent that he never left the tent. He always was receiving from Moshe. He was not teaching. He wasn't giving anyone else. He was just listening to Moshe. My father once told me about Rabbi Groner. Rabbi Groner is he's always so devoted to Rebbe. He is a genius. So that's my father. Why are you saying he's a genius? You're describing bittul. Bittul, not genius. He's a genius in bittul. To be able to he's always by Rebbe's side, and still to realize who he's working for, despite the fact that he's there all the time, that takes a lot of wisdom. Anyways, so the essence of Yeshua is that he's always a recipient of Moshe Rabbeinu, and he has nothing of himself. As the Gemara says, the Gemara is talking about the laws of kosher, and the Gemara says that when you salt meat, so the purpose of salting the meat is to cause the blood to come out of the meat so that the meat is kosher and none of the non-kosher blood is in the meat anymore. So Gemara asks, 1 second, there's salt on the meat. The salt is going to repel the blood back into the meat. So Gemara answers, since the salt is busy absorbing the blood, it's not going to exude any of the blood. Like a student was sitting in front of his teacher, that the whole essence of the student in front of the teacher is to receive from the teacher. Even after Moshe passes away, the whole essence of Yeshua is, and he is a servant of Moshe. How do we see that even after Moshe's passing, Yeshua is still considered a servant of Moshe? Because it says in the Torah clearly, after Moshe passes away, God speaks to Yeshua. The Torah describes Yeshua as the servant of Moshe. Even after God chose him to lead the Jewish people, he still was the servant of Moshe. He was absolutely nullified to Moshe. It says in a pasuk, I found one man out of 1,000, but one woman in all of these people I have not found. What is this pasuk referring to? A man out of 1,000, one unique man is referring to Moshe Rabbeinu. A woman, which means the idea of woman over here refers to the power of receiving. So Yeshua, who was a totally devoted student of Moshe Rabbeinu, or a chassid of Moshe Rabbeinu, and nothing of himself, and only his whole essence was to receive from Moshe, there is no one like him. He's unique. And b'chola elef, within the entire 1,000, there is no one like Yeshua. And therefore, Yeshua too, although he was considered also one of the great people of that generation, and he was alive during the sin, but he's not considered responsible for the sin of the generation because of his bittul. And that's the meaning of the pasuk. Because he is marpe, because he is weak, he is not considered responsible for the sins. What does that mean? He's weak. The fact that the leader of the generation weakens himself in the sense that he's not rising above the community and dominating them, and he has humility. Because of this, he is not considered responsible for their sins. So that's why Moshe, Yeshua, and Aaron are not considered responsible for the sin of the golden calf, because of their humility, because they are not gewaltikin. They're not dominating the community. Rather, they have the sense of weakness, the sense of humility. Another reason why Yehoshua was not considered responsible for the sin. He wasn't at all present in the Jewish camp. Where was he? He was in Moshe's tent. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu. Besides the fact that he was humble, another reason why he wasn't considered responsible because besides that he wasn't on earth. Yeshua, so to Yeshua, besides the fact that Yeshua was not considered responsible because of his humility, another reason why he's not considered responsible because he wasn't around. That's the meaning of the pasuk, that if you will be weak, you will leave great sins aside. That means by the great one of the generation, not raising himself up above everyone and ruling over everyone. Through this, he's not considered responsible. Now, Yonatan Hamburger's question is: 1 second, if he is lowering himself when he's able to be in a position of influence, so that should make him for sure responsible for the sin of generation. How come because he's humble do we say that he is not responsible? He's humble, and therefore he didn't raise himself above them, and therefore it's not considered his fault. On the contrary, let him raise himself above them, let him tell him what to do. No? The question resonates? There's the kasha. Okay, good question. Let's think about it. Let's come back to it tomorrow. But in short, what we did today is the reason why they're not considered responsible is because they have this humility, and because they're humility, they're not considered responsible. The question is, why does humility do that? Why does humility make you not responsible? It sounds like what the Alter describes in the beginning of Tanya, false humility. Alter says in Tanya, if you're able to tell someone something, you don't tell them, you get in trouble. So what's the shot over here that they're saying that because their humility, they're not responsible? To be continued.